One of the experiences I trust every homebrewer shares is the feeling of awe that comes from witnessing the conversion of wort into beer through the fermentation process. Even after 15 years, I still get giddy when I see the first signs of airlock activity, a nice fluffy kreuzen developing on top of my beer. The worst is when this takes too long. You all know the anxiety that comes from checking on a batch a day after pitching and seeing no action. This is why we love Imperial Yeast, who pack 200 billion cells of the purest yeast into each pitch right pouch, which assures quick starts, healthy fermentation, and predictably great results. I strongly urge all of our listeners to check out everything Imperial Yeast has to offer and let them know that you appreciate their support of the Brewlosophy podcast while you're at it. All right, on to the show. While brewed in certain regions for centuries, the concept of sour beer in the United States was largely associated with shoddy brewing practices, a batch that unintentionally came into contact with a wild yeast or bacteria, thus rendering it an unpalatable dumper. However, these days, sour beer has become a major focus for many brewers who aim to produce modern versions of styles developed in places like Belgium and, of course, Germany, where the subject of this particular episode originated. This is the Brewlosophy Podcast. I'm your host, Marshall Schott, and joining me on this episode to talk about Berliner Weisse is contributor Malcolm Frazer.
Style near and dear to my heart because it was one of the ones I started brewing in large quantities of those and gozas, 8-9 years ago. So I'm looking forward to this one, especially I think the intricacies of the style. You can go so many different ways with it. Boil, non-boil, quick, long. You can do extensive decoctions, or you can just kind of grip it and rip it, kind of like the short and shoddy we were going to talk about.
Yeah,
it has a lot of places to explore, and I think there's an interesting historical reconnection that's happening now, as we see in 16-ounce cans all over the country.
Yeah,
which we'll talk about in a little bit. But let's just say the fruited sour bombs that everyone loves, apparently by sales, and laments according to beer snobs, it has a historical connection.
Yeah. Well, from the first time I tried a Berliner Weisse way back when, I fell in love. I absolutely love the style. It took me a minute to acclimate to the idea of sour beer not being bad. I mean, that's just what we were taught when I started brewing. I'm sure you can relate, Malcolm. But I'll tell you, once I finally came around, I became a huge fan. And Berliner Weisse is close to the top of my list of favorite sour styles for various reasons. We're going to be taking a deep dive into this historic beer style, as well as talking about the results of my attempt to brew one using rather unconventional methods. All right, if you like what we're up to and want us to keep doing it, consider becoming a patron of Brewlosophy. By committing to a small monthly pledge over at patreon.com/Brewlosophy, you'll receive rewards like access to unpublished contributor recipes, unique discounts at YakimaValleyHops.com, and an invite to a monthly live Q&A session with somebody in the brewing world. Coming up in October is brewing water expert and legend, dare I say, and inventor of Brew and Water spreadsheet, Martin Brungard. No joke, if it wasn't for Martin, I would not view water chemistry the way that I do today. He's an amazing guy and an absolute wealth of knowledge, not just when it comes to water chemistry, but brewing in general. Malcolm, I know you're a big fan of Martin's work.
Yeah, I am, and he's actually been very helpful to me over this several years here. Definitely a legend of the water world.
Absolutely. He's a super smart guy. If you're into water, you're going to want to be a part of this session. You have to make your pledge at patreon.com/Brewlosophy by October 23rd, 2022. Be a part of the event. All past sessions are stored on our private Facebook page, so patrons can go back and watch them whenever they like. Learn more about becoming a patron again over at patreon.com/Brewlosophy. Feedback is brought to you by Brewers Hardware, who have an array of amazing purpose-built stainless brewing products to improve your brew day. If you're looking for a high-quality pilot brewery, make sure to check out the gorgeous BH15 single-tier system, which comes with a hard plumb manifold to eliminate all hosing changes during the brew process. Head over to brewershardware.com to see what they're all about, and make sure to mention Brewlosophy at checkout to receive a free gift. Again, that's brewershardware.com. David, I believe it's Shoddy from Germany, wrote in with some feedback on episode 151 where we talked about using olive oil in place of oxygenation. He said, back in May, I brewed an 1100 OG, 1.100 OG Doppelbock to test Bootleg Biology's Oslo ABV tolerance. All I pitched was 4 grams of self-dried Oslo flakes into the fermenter. It was a 6th or 7th generation repitch from myself, so it definitely didn't come straight from the lab. Here in Germany, it's very uncommon to use pure oxygen because people fear having flammable gas around. I always just splash the wort into the fermenter to get a nice foamy layer on top, and I've never ran into issues over 70 batches in the last 2 years. This Doppelbock fermented out fine and took just 3 days to get down to 10-12 FG, putting the beer at 11% ABV. That's a hell of a Doppelbock. It's so tasty and great looking. The head stays around forever on the beer. It's full bodied and it has a bit of an aroma of dark dried fruits. While you can definitely tell it's high in alcohol, it's not hot or anything like that. Now, David did send me a picture of this monster of a Doppelbock, and it really did look quite beautiful. I'd love to try it.
Love Doppelbocks, especially in the winter.
So I'm not sure. He had mentioned something about not using pure oxygen, but just splashing the wort. Maybe, I don't know, maybe olive oil would have worked in this case. I don't think he said he mentioned using olive oil, but I've had the same experience. I made a huge Russian Imperial Stout a couple years back, didn't add any oxygen, barely even splashed the wort around, and that thing fermented down in about 3 days, from like 1098 down to 1012 or something like that. So yeah, the whole oxygen argument is an interesting one for me.
Yeah, for me on the pro side, oxygen was a huge steering lever. We could very much affect fermentation rate and yeast growth by changing the oxygenation on the front end. But on the homebrew side, I've never really struggled much unless I got into big beer. So I'm surprised to hear you say that about the Imperial Stout or the Russian Imperial Stout. I am a fan of oxygenation just because what I've seen, but I think you can counteract it with a large, healthy pitch. So there's more than one way to get there. Yeah,
that's my thought as well, is that on the homebrew scale, we've got such small volumes and relatively large, healthy pitches that we're throwing into there. So I think that does kind of make up for the lack of oxygenation, perhaps. The other thing is, David mentioned he used a Kvike strain, this Oslo Flakes, even at just 4 grams. But that stuff is magical. I mean, it just eats up whatever you throw it at. So
it does seem to buck a lot of the conventional rules.
Sure
it almost seems like it thrives on abuse.
Yeah. Well, it did, again, that the beer looked amazing, David. Thank you for sending in the feedback. If you have show feedback, you could send it to feedback@brewlosophy.com or leave us a note on social media. I don't drink it often, but I certainly appreciate a good mead. Well, listener Joel Miller recently sent me a couple experimental batches that he made, one of which he calls Synergistic Effect, a strawberry margarita mead, which is actually made with a bit of agave syrup.
1 minute beer review with Jersey and Tim.
This looks like a mead.
I can tell this is either a sour or a hefferflizer.
A flipperflizer?
Tell me what it is, and I believe you.
I think it looks like a mead.
A mead?
Just the look of it.
Let's take a gander. Oh.
It's like apricot. It's good. It's strong.
How about this? Think about a drink.
It's good.
I like it a lot.
It's very good.
It's very good, but so is Bartles and James.
It's not a wine cooler.
It doesn't taste like poop. Good job. This tastes like Bartles and James.
Far from it.
Our friendship is on the line. Make a call.
A little apple apricot.
I hate this beer.
It's good.
My wife goes to Costco specifically for cotton candy grapes. You've seen those?
I have not.
You've seen those? They're grapes, and you put them in the freezer, and they taste like cotton candy. And that's what this tastes like.
I'm on board with that. I give it a 9.
I give it 4. Total of 3.
If you recall, Joel is the same guy that made the cream cheese mead that the guys thought tasted like cream soda. So he's certainly got a knack for doing some weird stuff with mead, and he does it surprisingly well. The Synergistic Effect strawberry margarita mead that he made was really, really good. I had read before I tasted the mead that it was made with some agave syrup. So part of me was kind of waiting for a kind of almost like a tequila flavor. It was so smooth and so tasty. Some people just have that creative mind and they're able to put flavors together in their head and then create it in real life. I think Joel did a killer job.
Yeah, I like the fact that the guys noticed right away what it was, and then the descriptions were pretty close, especially with the agave. To me, always lends this almost medicinal effect. So they didn't mention that, but I like the white grape descriptors and the cotton candy.
Yeah,
of course I didn't have the mead, but
the cotton candy one was exactly what I tasted. I didn't get anything medicinal. Have you fermented agave before?
Yeah, and I think it does. I think it can be done well in low amounts or in the right beer, but I get a similar thing with agave and honey in that when it's too high, the beer, to me, starts going towards this medicinal flavor.
That's interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah, there are certain things that I don't think my brain would ever on its own consider using in beer, and agave syrup's one of them. So the fact that Joel got away with using it and it didn't turn medicinal, it was actually really good. Killer job, Joel. Again, thank you for sending us your meads and all those beers that you sent as well. If you'd like to have your beer or any other fermented beverage reviewed by Jersey and Tim on the show, you can email me, marshall@brewlosophy.com, and we'll get you all set up. When we return from this break, the focus will be on Berliner Weisse. After a long brew day, the last thing I want to do is waste more time chilling wort. I've tried so many different options, and ultimately I settled on the super efficient immersion chillers made by Jaded Brewing. With the King Cobra and Hydra, I'm able to chill my entire batch of wort, from boiling to just a few degrees above groundwater temperature, in as little as 6 minutes. If an immersion chiller is right for your brewery, then do yourself a favor and check out all of the rad options Jaded Brewing has to offer at jadedbrewing.com. And be sure to let them know Brewlosophy sent you.
Compact and simple to use with a small footprint for brewing indoors, the Grainfather makes it easy for you to brew professional quality beers at home. The Grainfather is an all-in-one brewing system that lets you brew all grain beer in a single compact stainless steel unit. It uses an electric heating element and pump to maintain a constant temperature and to circulate the wort during the mashing and cooling stages. It also comes with a counterflow chiller to reduce chilling times and produce high-quality wort. And now, with the addition of their conical fermenter, the Grainfather takes things one step further by offering homebrewers state-of-the-art temperature-controlled fermentation just like commercial breweries use. And with the Grainfather Recipe Creator and Connect app, you can easily design a recipe, sync your brewing system with your phone, and then just sit back and relax as the app takes over and assures that you maintain your scheduled mash temps and boil schedule. Head to Grainfather.com to purchase your all-in-one brewing system today and to sign up for their free recipe creator tool. Once more, head on over to Grainfather.com, that's Grainfather.com, and get started today.
Family-owned Atlantic Brew Supply is the largest homebrew shop in the Southeast. No gimmicks, no multinational corporate overlords, and no BS. They offer exclusive malts, yeast, and more from local artisans, as well as award-winning recipe kits. They also sell professional brewing gear and cask equipment from sister companies ABS Commercial and Cask Supply. Most ingredients are available by the ounce, plus Atlantic Brew Supply has an on-site calculator to help you craft your best brew. Orders are processed same day, and 2-day shipping is guaranteed for East Coast customers. Get 15% off your first order using promo code BREWPOD, that's BRUPOD, at AtlanticBrewSupply.com. It had to have been 9 or 10 years ago now that I tried my first Berliner Weisse. After visiting Russian River Brewing Company in Santa Rosa, California, where my buddy and I fell in love with their more traditionally brewed Belgian sours, I obsessively bought bottles of whatever other commercial sour beers I could find on store shelves wherever I was at. One of which was, I believe it's called Fritz Bream Berliner Weisse, a German beer that was apparently brewed, or it's been brewed at least, since 1809, which really speaks to how old this style is.
Yeah, I mean, it goes way back, and depending on which beer historian you read, there's different versions of it, and some of them do a good job of saying it could be this and it could be that, you know.
Yeah.
But Berlin itself, they say its brewing revolution started somewhere around 1572, right? And then going on through the mid-1600s, it became like very cosmopolitan. You know, it was very popular, you know, industrial and artsy city.
Yeah.
And when you have that, you have people, they like drinking. And what happened was this beer became very popular and synonymous with the area. And the beer, they believe, or some people believe, was influenced heavily by another eponymous beer, which is the Bräuhain. So the Bräuhain was a Hanover Hamburg brewer, Cord Bräuhain. And that beer was a wheat and potentially sour beer as well, and lower gravity. So some people feel that probably influenced the Berlin brewers.
Huh.
But the beer was so popular that it's like, go look at what's happening now with New England IPAs and soured fruited sours. This is what happened in Berlin and surrounding areas in like the 1800s. Most of the breweries in Berlin were just made to make this. And there's actually articles you can read, and they're hilarious, about the de-evolution of craft. Basically, there's a great article
from the 1800s, an article about how craft beer is declining because of Berliner Weisse. Is that what you're saying?
Essentially, there was an author, Grenell, lamenting about the state of beer in Berlin because all these breweries and then pubs were opening so quickly to be able to make this beer and serve this beer. Because back then, you'd have a brewer and then the publican, the German equivalent, he would receive, or she would, well, probably he back then, would receive the beer and then condition it on site, right?
Right.
Very similar to what cask beer would be like. So he was lamenting the fact that, well, just about everyone's becoming a landlord now, and they lack the skills to serve beer properly and take care of it and condition it. And, being a curmudgeon, you see some people out there who are opening, breweries who aren't necessarily, super great at the craft. And you see a lot of people who own beer bars who aren't necessarily serving it in the most snobbish,
right,
Cicerone-like way, right?
Yeah.
And it seems like they're very more in for the zeitgeist and maybe the money, probably the money. But here we're talking about the 1800s, and it's the same complaints. We haven't changed, people. We're the same people, So this beer became so popular, it started to get haters, and this guy was writing about it in the 1800s about how no one's serving it right, and the beer's becoming shit.
That's hilarious. It's funny. It actually does make me think of. It's so relatable because you've got all these people today who, all of us have a lot of friends who are professional brewers at this point, and you hear them on the side talking about how they wish they could just make, pale lager or Vienna lager or these really clean, simple beers, but the only things people want to buy right now are these slushy, sweet, bombs. I could just imagine back in the 19th century Germany, people kind of say, what is with, we're spending all of this time crafting these great beers and we send it off to these pubs. People just want to be landlords and serve it their own way, and they're not taking care of it and having that be the issue.
They're storing it warm, they're serving it in dirty glasses, and they're a brewer.
Yeah.
The brewer's sitting there complaining, all I want to do is make lagers, right? Supposedly.
Yeah.
I think they want to make them because they can't. So, it's the same thing. We just haven't changed. We're the same people.
Yeah, that's funny. Well, when it comes to Berliner Weisse, this is technically a sour style. I have to imagine, and maybe there's not good history on this or written down at least, but I have to imagine that it was a style that developed not necessarily out of intention, that sour component was kind of like a lot of things in brewing when we talk about, hundreds of years ago, that it just kind of happened. And then brewers learned how to consistently produce this product because they liked it. But it's not like they were tossing in, other microbes intentionally in the beginning, at least, was it?
I'm not sure if there's literature out there to confirm or deny that. And what it seems to me is the method they were using. And then, to be fair, depending on which brewing records you look at, you can go to Barclay Perkins or Shut Up About Barclay Perkins or Cornell or Dornbush or whoever you prefer. But different brewers reported different ways. So to sit there and say Berliner was made this way is a foolhardy task.
Sure.
It's insane because originally it looked like it was smoked malt. There was weak beer and full strength beer, vol beer, and then also very, very strong, well, not very strong, but strong for the time, which they called the Marzen type beer. So they had like 14 Plato OG Berliner Weisses.
Jeez, my knees.
Now, did that become the most popular one? No, it seemed like the prevalent style was eventually non-smoked malt. It looked like it was eventually somewhat weaker in the 3% ABV range. So, when you're trying to make a style guideline for a competition, because that's what the AHA is for, right? Mostly. There's some historical components to it as well, but you have to set the mark somewhere, right? And you have to say, well, what is the preponderance of the evidence? So we'll go with this,
Yeah.
Unless you do like the low strength, high strength, middle strength, or with the IPA session, high strength imperial, whatever. But essentially, it seems like the prevailing way was about 3%. It was mostly wheat, somewhere in the realm of 2 to 3 parts wheat to pale malt. But at the same time, there was at least 2 breweries that were doing 100% pale malt, no wheat. So for everything you can think of, there's an exception.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
The boil, no boil thing. There was some places that were doing no boiling, but there were some places doing decoction. So aren't you boiling? Right? Everyone seemed to be using hops, but where were the hops added? Some were adding in the kettle. Some were mash hopping.
Right.
We could never go over all the styles. There would have to be almost a show per method.
The different versions of Berliner Weisse, in essence, is what you're saying. Yeah, and I get that. I mean, if you were to ask one brewer, you go to Ken Grossman and say, "What is American Pale Ale?" And he just gives you his version of it. Well, that's going to completely leave out all of the other different versions that people have developed in the ways that they are brewing their pale ale. So yeah, I think that's interesting. Now this is a Berliner Weisse, and my understanding, if my German is not very good, but Weiss means white, and I think that's a term that gets associated with beers that are made with a high proportion of wheat malt, which Berliner Weisse technically or traditionally is made with a pretty decent portion of wheat. Let's get into the style description. In terms of appearance, this is a style that, in my experience, has been, it looks kind of like a Hefeweizen. It's got that really pale straw yellow color and tends to maintain a fairly stable haze, right?
Well, yeah, and then just to counter you, because I like to.
Yes, you do.
Yeah, I mean, mostly it's just to be a cartoon, but it's also I like to bring up certain exceptions. So go look at Hefeweizens, like popular ones like a Paulaner. It's more of a deep gold.
It really is.
It borders orange. But yes, I think I like a Franziskaner, which to me is a lighter yellow glowing hue. I mean, Paulaner is delicious. Don't get me wrong, but yes, it does seem to be that the Berliners were considered to have. I've seen the descriptor in some old text, of course it was translated, of what they called a secondary glow, a secondary, as almost as if there's like the original color and there's like an aura behind it.
Yeah.
Kind of glowing. And I like that because it's pretty. But it does seem to be very, very pale. And in fact, one of the reasons why there was no boils is believed to be to preserve that super whiteness. And one of the prevailing characteristics was supposed to be that doughy, bready cracker character.
Yeah.
Well, that seems to go away, and you go towards more the cooked realm of flavors if you boil or decoct too aggressively. So in order to preserve that bready doughiness, you don't boil, or you boil very gently and very short period of time. The aroma, is going to follow the flavor. Flavor is the confluence of all these things, but the aroma would tend to follow the bready, doughy characteristics, and then you can get this soft lactic souring.
Yeah.
And when I think lactic sour, I think yogurt. But you have to kind of strip away the dairy component.
Yes.
If you get the dairy component, you've gone too much. You've gone too far.
You might have dropped yogurt into your beer. Yeah.
Yeah, but think of like a lambic, which which to me has like that almost aspirin like biting sourness, which I like, which pairs well with fruit. But this is more of like a lactic, soft sour. It's not aggressive, and even though you could have registered a pH in the low 3s, and you can take your titratable acid and have 3, 4, 5%, it still is not as aggressive, and that's the characteristic of the acid,
right?
The acid's strength. So lactic acid is not as a strong of an acid. It doesn't as readily give up its H component, hydronium. So that characteristic comes through, but also you may get a small amount of hop character. It seems to me to almost be like people say it's there because they know there's hops in it. Yeah. Because very, very traditionally there's very little hops. Yeah. A couple 100 grams max per 50 kilograms or 120 pounds of grain. So another characteristic might be lemon tart or green apple skins. and that's believed to be a mixture of fermentation esters and the lactic acid.
Yeah, to me it's interesting because I feel like there is a in most sour beers, when I smell it, there is a particular sour aroma that I get, particularly when it's a lactic acid souring, which is Berliner Weisse is typically known for. And I feel like we describe it based on what we associate that sour smell, quote unquote, that, so like I do associate it with almost like a citrus lemony thing. And so when I smell, when I take a Berliner Weisse that I really enjoy and I smell it, I absolutely get doughy. I get like raw dough more than I get bready. And I get this hint of lemon, but I know that it's not necessarily citrus. It is this lactic acid the component that I'm smelling, and that my brain associates with something like citric acid, like lemon. So
I think it smells, and I make a lot of bread, and I think it smells like sourdough starter before it starts leaning on the acetic vinegar side. So
interesting. Yeah.
It's like late on day one of a sourdough starter or early on day two, where right before it starts to go with vinegar and you have mostly that soft sour with the sweet malt still there.
Yeah.
That to me is like the essence of what I imagine a great Berliner Weisse is. The ones I truly enjoy anyways.
No, I agree.
The flavors are gonna follow aroma, like I alluded to earlier. So same stuff, right? Doughy, bready, weedy potentially, lemony. Some people get apple. I think if you go too far apple, those are the ones I don't enjoy as much.
Yep.
Especially when they get bruised apple, browned apple, whatever. I like them to be more like a background note of Granny Smith skin. Too far, and I think it's not a great fermentation.
Yeah, and I think a lot of that, you've talked before about certain yeast strains as imparting that kind of an apple skin type of characteristic in a pleasant way. I think you mentioned before that Kolsch can have a little hint of that. And I could see a Berliner Weisse being fermented with Kolsch. We're going to talk about different yeast strains you can ferment this with in a bit. In terms of, just to finish up, to round out the style description, in my experience, a good Berliner Weisse it's bordering on thin, but it's so carbonated that it balances that thinness out, and it makes it almost like a soda, very, very refreshing. And of course, we're talking about unadulterated Berliner Weisse here. There are it's very commonly adulterated style here. But is that your experience as well? It's almost like the wheat backs up a little bit of that body, but it's not. It still doesn't make it thick, and then that extra carbonation. I like to really highly carbonate my Berliner Weisse. Just kind of balances the whole thing out, despite being super low in alcohol.
Well, I think traditionally they were very dry, almost to the point where there was, up to 100% attenuation.
Yeah.
Mathematically. And so that would be bracingly dry, especially in consideration of the sourness that remains. So they should be very, very dry and very thin. And that's why they were often consumed with a side of syrup, mit Schuss, with shot. Very light in body, super highly carbonated. And the ones that were given to the pub, which in most of the brewing writers refers to the customer, because they were selling to the pub, and then the pub would then sell to their customers.
Uh-huh.
So when they would sell to their customers, it was in need of conditioning. So they would have to kreuzen, so the brewer could kreuzen before giving it, and then it had to be capped up and bottled. Or there was some references to like late summer brews, probably because of the warmer temperatures and rapid fermentation. It wasn't easy to catch the beer with a young kreuzen beer.
Sure.
So then they would say, oh, this is a summer version of Berliner, so it has to have a few hundred grams, per barrel of sugar, and they would call it cooking sugar or baker's sugar. So basically, the pub is conditioning them. So you can imagine the rate seemed to be high. It would be like conditioning with like 80 grams, of sugar. So that would be effervescent. And there's a reason why the story goes, Napoleon calling it the champagne of the North, or Napoleon and or his troops, whatever story you believe. But they refer to it as the champagne of the North. And that story seems to meet out because there are some breweries that later on put the word or a play on the word champagne on their label.
Oh, really?
So you can go,
That's interesting.
You can go research old labels, and there would be some, almost punny reference or like a word, what do they call that? Like a portmanteau of champagne into the name of the beer. It's kind of neat.
Yeah, it is. I like that. Well, obviously, very historical style of beer. Let's spend a little bit of time talking about just the typical ingredients. And it's tough to talk about just the ingredients separate from the process, but we are going to hit on both of those. We talked a little bit about the grains that you might use. 50-50 Pilsner malt or pale malt and wheat malt. Is that pretty common, you'd say?
Well, old records would say anywhere from 2 to 5 parts wheat to pale, but there were at least 2 prominent breweries that were all pale malt.
No wheat whatsoever, right? Yeah.
No wheat whatsoever. But funny is a couple of the beer historians would say, well, but they weren't very good.
Gotta have that wheat in there. That's
Yeah.
what I was going to say is I get, whenever I use big proportions of wheat malt, you and I've talked about this, Malcolm, I get just a hint of that almost lactic lemony flavor. So I could see how maybe if that's the case, if others get that as well, I could see how that might contribute to this style's overall characteristic, kind of playing melding or marrying well with that sour component.
I remember that used to be said a lot, and I don't know if I agree or not. When I get a high proportion of wheat, to me it leans towards earthy, and it starts going almost buckwheat. Huh. But I guess that's the beauty of different palates and different descriptors, right?
Yeah.
So it is what you think it is, probably. Unless you're completely wrong. Unless you're tasting a lemon and saying it tastes like chocolate.
There you go. Yeah.
There's room in there for your own sensations and your own perspective.
Yeah. So then, obviously it's a style that doesn't, you're not hopping this style very much. In fact, I think a lot of people brew their Berliner Weisse without any hop additions whatsoever, maybe just kind of blow some dust off of their hand.
If you go to the Milk the Funk page, they have a great write-up on Berliner Weisse for what it's worth and a good recipe. No hops. A lot of the strains that are bought commercially seem to be counterintuitively hop sensitive. They can be trained for what it's worth. I've done this at a brewery where you can, take one that's been brewed with a small amount of hops, and it seems like over time it can get into like the 8 to 10 IBU range. And there's definitely some strains out there that are more tolerant, but a lot of them don't like any IBUs. Just the presence of some alpha acids, which is the reason why hops were used in beer, right? And that's probably why the mash hopping was done, so that they could preclude the microbes that are inherent to the environment of the brewery and the grain. So you add a little mash hop, and then you hit the beer later when it's cooled down to like 95 to 100 Fahrenheit, and then you inoculate it with your own yeast. So those hops are there just basically to set up the environment for your inoculation, which is your house character, and so you don't get the resident and ubiquitous lactobacillus from the air. And so very light hopping. Any hop character is probably a fault. Bitterness is a fault.
Yeah.
Not to say you can't play with it and make your own home brew version. Dry hopped Berliner Weisse. You do you, but.
Yeah, but per guidelines, you're not expecting this to have much hop, if any at all, much hop character. Now let's spend some time talking about microbes, because this is where I think Berliner Weisse can go down a couple different paths. For one, you've got your souring microbes, which can be a couple different things. Then you've got the yeast that you use to ultimately ferment the beer out, and those can go. You've got a couple different options with that as well. First off, let's talk a little bit about how, at least in modern times, I know that again, there's a lot of history behind this style, but how are brewers today who want to make a classic, Berliner Weisse, how are they getting that lactic or that sour character into the beer?
Predominantly kettle souring. That's the
new common thing, right?
And you can call that wort souring, kettle souring, hot side souring, whatever you want to call it. Essentially, a lot of bigger breweries especially feel more comfortable with it because you're doing it on the hot side and it's going to get boiled and then cooled. So whatever you've used to sour the beer, lactobacillus, but whatever strain you use are however you're getting it from a few handfuls of grain or from a commercial pitch or whatever in a house culture that you keep back, keg, and then use again. You put it into a lauter tun or a boil kettle and hold it, 18 to up to 36 hours, 72 hours for some people, which is crazy to me. But most of the commercial strains can get you to your desired acidity in at least a day, maybe day and a half. So they do it it depends on how your brewery's set up, but some people will do it in the brew kettle. They'll lauter off and collect their wort, and there you can cool it down to like 190. 90 degrees Fahrenheit. What is that?
About
Celsius?
30, 35 Celsius, something like that. Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah. So depending on the strain, again, strains have their optimal range. Most of them are around 100 to 90. So you can cool it various ways. Whirlpool it through your heat exchanger and send it back in. But for home brewers, it's really easy. You can just leave it out, or you can just dip your immersion chiller in there for a couple minutes, and you'll get to 90 in a blink.
In a heartbeat, yeah.
Yeah. So, and then you pitch your souring microbes. So that is like souring on the front end, and then you come back the next day or day and a half, 2 days later, and then you boil it, effectively stopping the souring process and killing the lactobacillus, right?
Yeah. So this is a part of the process talk, is that you're doing multiple steps that you wouldn't do if you're making a regular clean beer. And yeah, that's how I've done it as well. Is pre-souring is how I refer to it. So you're souring up front, and then you're coming back, killing off whatever microbes you put in there to sour it. Now, correct me if I'm wrong. I think the most commonly used souring microbe for Berliner Weisse, at least, is what we refer to as lab or lactic acid bacteria, which like you said, you can get that from multiple sources. Probiotics, yogurt. I know a lot of people are using Good Belly.
Yep.
I've used multiple times, and in the short and shoddy that we'll talk about in a bit, I use uncrushed grain, which is abundant with lactic acid bacteria on it. And then once you get that souring to the point where you want, bring that temperature back up and kill off that bacteria, and then chill it back down to normal fermentation temps and pitch a yeast. Now, the type of yeast you use to ferment this style of beer, can you go with something that's POF positive, like a Hefeweizen strain, or do you want to stick specifically with a cleaner yeast strain?
I think traditionally it was probably what they call the top fermenting ale strain. So it would probably be a German ale strain, such as one used in Köln or Dusseldorf. So, fairly clean. So
yeah.
I like using Kolsch. I've used the alt beer strains. I think you can do whatever you want. I know a lot of commercial places that will use the yeast they have in-house, which will be a Kale Ale strain.
Sure. Something clean, though. I mean, it sounds to me like I would love to try. I'm not a huge Hefeweizen fan, but I enjoy it occasionally. I would love to try a Berliner Weisse that's fermented with like a classic, the Weihenstephan Hefeweizen strain or something. I bet it could be pretty good.
I think a wit beer strain would be perfect too, which
Sure.
also tend to kick out some clove notes. That's the brewer's art, and there's a lot of funky things going on in a Berliner. So if you're using a Brett heavy secondary anyways, why not play it up? And,
yeah.
Brett seemed to love those phenolics as precursors, so you can get some interesting stuff there. So don't be constrained to only using some Kolsch, strain.
Yeah.
I use that, what's that, K97 or whatever it's called?
That dry yeast, yeah.
The dry yeast. I use that to some success too.
Well, you mentioned Brett. Let's spend a minute talking about that, because in my experience, again, here in 2020, most of the, if not all of the Berliner Weisses that I've had have been very clean. It's not, I don't get that Brett, that horse blanket, Brett character out of them. But I know that, especially if you're looking back historically, there's no way that Berliner Weisse wasn't being brewed in a way where wild yeast or Brettanomyces was involved in some way. Talk a little bit about how that, plays with Berliner Weisse.
Well, once again, you can go to some of these write-ups, and you can see like there was a write-up in which a guy did like a comparison of 3 or 4 prominent breweries and the methods they were using, and some were doing kettle souring, a version of what we do, where they sour, then boil, and then ferment. And then some places were doing a co-pitch, which was I think most common back then, which they had their own barm or slurry of their house culture, which was a mix at some point of yeast and lacto and probably Brettanomyces, various strains. And some places would actually funny enough, add a dried lacto powder.
Huh.
So I think that was like 1 or 2 places, and they were also not considered to be the best. So, but who knows?
Yeah.
Probably not. So it really depends, and it does seem. I think Escarpment Labs, Richard, who we had on recently, right? For as part of the Patreon. So his lab did some culturing of old bottles, and they found Brettanomyces, a couple different strains, in a few different bottles. So, and these were older bottles that were given to him for this project.
Yeah.
So that's worth a read. I think it's posted either on his page or in Milk the Funk. But he had, I think, 4 or 5 bottles, and most of them, all but one, came back with Brett. I think I'm going from memory, so sorry, but it does seem to be inherent to the style. And some people say if there's not a little bit of that funk there, it's not a Berliner. But people say a lot of things.
But there's multiple ways you can get a little bit of that kind of funky thing in a Berliner, though. In my experience,
it could be. Brettanomyces tends to be slower acting because it tends to be in lower cell density. So unless you're really throwing a lot of Brettanomyces at it, so it could be part of the co-pitch, which I guess no longer a co-pitch, is a tri-pitch, whatever. But you could have your yeast, your lacto, and your Brett in there, and then after secondary conditioning, it continues to work and its character becomes more expressive.
Sure.
But this beer was mostly drank young. So if it had some Brett character, it was kind of a nuance, in my opinion. But some people do believe that when it's gone, the beer becomes insipid and it's not as characterful. But I wasn't around
Oh, you sure?
drinking these beers. So I don't know. I love Brett. So the idea of having some complexity is awesome to me. But what I've found is a lot of people find the Brett character off-putting,
or overwhelms the other more subtle intricacies of the Berliner Weisse style. I've had a couple Brett fermented Berliner Weisses, and they're good. They're very bready though, and that kind of becomes the feature as opposed to that doughy lactic
very
thing.
Brett-y, yes, not
exactly.
bready, but yeah, exactly. And and I think if you got a Brett strain that gave you the hay notes, that would be awesome. The hay and the wheat and the bread. I think if you got one that was more in the medicinal, smoky notes, I would not care for as well.
No.
But if you're a good blender and you're good with flavors, if you brought in this slightly smoky Brett and then you had like peaches, I'm thinking grilled peaches, and I'm all on it. I'm right there. Give me that.
That does sound good. I'm with you. And there are, I believe is it Classenii that creates this kind of pineapple mango flavor, and I could see that melding really well. I mean, Berliner Weisse is often fruited, or has some syrup in it, and messing around. This is one of those styles I feel like is just so open to possibilities because it's got so many. It's just so simple and its base, and you can add so much to it to make it taste good. Now, what I'd like to do to finish up this segment is just run through the brewing process in sort of a step-by-step way, because I do think it can get confusing for people who've maybe never brewed a Berliner Weisse before. First off, water chemistry. Would you do anything special other than maybe aim for like a balanced profile?
Yeah, balanced yellow or malty. You don't want a lot of minerals in there because it's going to get dry if you do it that way. It's going to be highly attenuated. You can end up making an Alka-Seltzer beer.
Ugh.
So low minerals, more chloride, or at least balanced, but low overall. We're talking like 50s for everything.
Exactly.
50 or lower. 50 ppm.
Yeah, 50 ppm, sulfate to chloride, keep it balanced. That's kind of where I'm at as well. Now, this is where things get interesting. When you mash this beer, you can mash. I think traditionally, I'm sure there was either a decoction or single infusion, but split up. I typically do full volume. That's just the way I brew. But mashing maybe around 150 F. You want this beer to dry out, so that's where I've stuck to. Malcolm, anything on a mash, and you're going to run it about 60 minutes. A typical 1 hour mash to encourage that full conversion.
Well, staying with theme on everyone did everything differently. There was infusion mashes, there was decoctions, but they were using undermodified malts. So they some of them did these super extensive, like hour longs at each step, mashing in like in the 35 range, which is 35 C, 100 F, and bringing it up, 10 degrees F.
Yeah.
So
every step hour. Mash, yeah.
So super, very, very much so designed to thin the beer out, make use of every enzyme step.
Yeah.
So we're talking hours to mash these.
Yeah.
But we're not there. We have more modified malts.
Yes.
It's not necessary. You can do it for fun if you want to. Not very short and shoddy, very long and meticulous, which is a different segment, totally different show.
Yeah, we'll start a different series.
Yeah, but what I would say is you can take advantage of our modern ingredients by doing like a 144 to 148. That's where I would go. You said 150, talking Fahrenheit.
Yeah.
Fine. Somewhere around there.
Yeah. Encourage that beta amylase though, right? You really want that beta amylase enzyme to
want this to be highly attenuated.
That's right.
Attenuatable wort. So yes, you want it to thin out. So yes, 145 to 150 Fahrenheit. What is that in Celsius?
Yeah, gosh, what is it, like 42, 43, something like that. Anyways, we gotta. But okay, so you get done with the mash, and this is where things get a little bit fun. In my process with a brew in a bag, I pull the grain, so you lauter, you collect that wort, and then you wanna make sure that you're starting off with a clean base. So you bring it up to a boil, but you're not doing a typical boil. You're just bringing it up to that temperature, so that 100 C, 212 Fahrenheit, just for a very short amount of time to kill off any microbes that are in the wort. And in my experience and what my friends do is we're talking 5 to 10 minutes, and then you chill it back down to about 35 C, which I believe is about 100 Fahrenheit.
95.
95 Fahrenheit or so. And then that's when, so now you've brought it up, you killed that stuff off, then you immediately chill it back down. And that's when you introduce the lactic acid bacteria or the other microbes that you're going to use to sour this wort.
Yes. And that's what I was doing. I was doing barely a boil just to, quote, sanitize or sterilize, almost all strains, except for there's one or two that seem to be very, very temperature tolerant, but almost all of them will be gone then. So now you're starting with a clean, known platform, a blank canvas. So now whatever you put into the beer at 95 Fahrenheit, 35 Celsius will be what gives you your character, your sourness.
And this could be anything from Good Belly, probiotic pills. They got to be the proper kind. Google it. There's so many options out there. You could use a bacteria from a lab, a professional lab. You could toss in some uncrushed grain, whatever you're going to use, and then you hold it at that temperature, that 95 F, for 24 hours to. I mean, I've heard of people going up to 3 days. I've never had to go that long. That warmer temperature really encourages that bacteria to do its thing.
Yeah, most things happen faster when it's warm, as long as you don't go too warm where you kill it. So I love Omega strain because it's just very predictable, it's quick, and it's also very temperature tolerant. So if you happen to be wanting to do one of these in a colder climate and it dips below 80 Fahrenheit, it still works. That's like 80 Fahrenheit, it's like 27 Celsius, but it still works very well. It works slower, of course.
Yeah.
But at this point, we're talking tasting and get it to where you want it.
And then once it's where you want it, you just bring it back up to a boil. If you're doing it in your kettle, if not, you got to put it back in your kettle, bring that back up to a boil. And then this is where, if you're going to add any hops, you would do it typically, right?
You could have mash hopped, or you could do it now.
Yeah.
So either or. But that's just to kill off the lacto, and you don't have to. People were boiling it because they were afraid of bringing bugs over into their other side of the clean, cold side of their cellar. So professional brewers were doing it, and home brewers were doing it to make this a clean process. You do not have to boil here. You can.
Yeah. The reason I do it is because I'm a neurotic, and I like knowing that I'm done. I've finished with this lactic acid bacteria, bring it up to a boil, add any hops, blow some hop powder over it, then chill it back down, pitch your yeast, let it ferment like normal. And then the only other thing to me that makes it different from this point forward is that I really like to go highly carbonated. I want this style of beer to be sparkling, effervescent, soda-like. And so that's what I do. I burst carbonate at about 45 to 50 PSI over 24 hours, and then I keep it at 14 to 16 PSI to serve.
Yeah. And don't be afraid to keg condition. If you want to go simple, you could do a calculation, one of the various calculators, and throw in some priming sugar in your keg.
Yeah.
And you have to get a very long line because you're going to be you're gonna be serving a super highly carbonated beer.
Yeah.
But if you can get into that magical like 4 volume range with a Berliner, it's awesome.
It's awesome. Yeah,
It's
I agree.
awesome.
Well, for as much as I love Berliner Weisse, I haven't brewed too many in my day. I'm not really sure why. It's not that it's a difficult style to brew in my experience. Anyway, I was thirsting for a crushable low alcohol sour beer a while back, and without plans, threw a batch together using just the ingredients I had on hand and relying on some pretty questionable methods. How'd it turn out? Results when we return. The brew in a bag method has blown up over the last few years, and in that time, it's become very clear that not all bags are created equal. For the best BIAB experience, you have got to go with the brew bag. Made from high-quality, food-safe polyester, the brew bag is available in both 210 micron for standard brew in a bag, as well as 400 micron, which works beautifully for all-in-one recirculating systems. I've been a brew bag user for years and wouldn't brew without it. Head over to brewinabag.com to get the fabric filter that works for you and use promo code TBP17 at checkout to receive a discount. Again, that's brewinabag.com. Have you ever thought about adding a port to your kettle but held off because you didn't feel like drilling into your gear or sending it off to have someone else do it? From the makers of the world's fastest counterflow chiller, the Exchillerator, comes the Hangover, the easiest way to add extra ports to your kettle as well as countless other options. Mount a faucet to your keg for easy portable pouring. Set up the perfect whirlpool arm. Hold a heating element in place. All of this and so much more without permanently modifying your gear. Manufactured right here in the United States, the Hangover offers brewers too many convenient solutions to list here. So head over to Exchillerator.com today to see what the Hangover can do for you. As every brewer knows, the best beer requires the best hops, which Yakima Valley Hops provides fresh from the source to brewers around the world, carrying everything from classics like Cascade to modern favorites like Galaxy and Mosaic, as well as other ingredients and gear. Yakima Valley Hops has it all. And don't forget to check out their new podcast, The Late Edition, where the YVH crew goes into depth on our favorite plant with industry experts. Head over to YakimaValleyHops.com now to see all they have to offer and subscribe to The Late Edition wherever it is you listen to podcasts. Craftmaster Growlers takes traveling with and sharing beer to a new level. Made from heavy-duty stainless steel, Craftmaster Growlers are double-wall insulated and can keep beer cold for up to 8 hours. Unlike typical growlers, Craftmaster Growlers come with a swiveling tap and fully integrated CO2 regulator cap, allowing beer to stay fresh for 2 weeks or more. The square design takes up less space and will fit in most refrigerator doors, and every Craftmaster Growler comes with a 1-year warranty. There are 64 and 128-ounce versions available over at craftmastergrowlers.com. Back in December of 2018, I had a group of dudes over to my place for a data collection session, and we started talking about my new, at the time, SS Brewtech 1V electric brewing system. After going over some of its features, I mentioned I was looking forward to making some kettle sours with it, seeing as it can hold very specific temperatures very easily. Well, one thing led to another, and one beer led to a few beers, so we figured we'd throw something together right then, and there it was at this point that I realized I had no wheat on hand, and having already committed to brewing this beer, we opted for a unique substitution. While my friends hung out in my garage and drank more beer, I ran to my computer, threw together a very simple recipe, and returned about 5 minutes later to start brewing. Now, this was a full volume brew in a bag, so I collected the full volume of water and got that heating up. I don't recall the exact start time. Again, we were having a good time socializing, but it was somewhere around 4 p.m. After collecting the full volume of water, which I filtered, I turned on the element to heat it up while my buddy Tony Clark measured out and milled the relatively small amount of grains. Again, you're aiming for low ABV in this style, so it wasn't much. I used 68% La Manta Pale Malt, which was 4.25 pounds or 1.9 kg, and then 32% flaked oats. Flaked oats, that's not wheat. We didn't have any wheat, so I just went looking around for something similar, and I settled on flaked oats.
You didn't have wheat flour? You didn't have wheat flour in your house?
No, I don't have wheat. I had nothing wheat-like except for maybe some sweet cereal in my pantry the kids were eating.
You're killing me, Smalls. I would have put freaking Wheaties in there or something.
I don't have Wheaties either. Well, this was going to be a fun experiment for me. So technically, what we ended up calling this one was a Berliner Weisse mit Hafer, which I believe means with oats.
Yes.
So 68%, again, 68% La Manta, that's Mecca grade state malt, pale malt, And that's 4.25 pounds to the 2 pounds or 0.9 kilograms of flaked oats. That was 32% flaked oats. So not quite 50-50. What I did is I had that Rob's or whatever, Bob's Red Mill flaked oats on hand, and one bag of that stuff is 2 pounds. So I just used the whole bag of it. I'm telling you, I'm thinking, hey, wheat, oats, not terribly different. Let's see how this turns out. When the water was to strike temperature, my friend Roger Gardenhire stirred the grains in. We had a couple more beers. We let that wort or that mash at 150 degrees Fahrenheit or 66 C for, I guess it was about an hour. We just kind of sat around and helped, kind of waited and talked. And then when we were ready to move on, we did. So once the mash rest was complete, again, it was at 150 F. I didn't keep the controller on, so it probably dropped down to about 148 F or 65 C over that 1 hour-ish period. But once the mash rest was complete, the grain bag was removed and left to drip into the wort while the wort was heating up. And the goal here, again, we wanted to eliminate any unwanted microbes. So that's the reason I heated that wort up immediately after the mash to a boil. Again, we boiled it for about 15 minutes. Now again, a little bit out of my wits and not really following, I guess, the recommended procedure when it comes to making a Berliner Weisse. This is where we added 2 grams of Magnum hops. The only reason I add hops to a Berliner Weisse is because beer's not beer unless you have hops in it, right? And so to me, I was just thinking, get them in there, and I'm so used to doing it right after the mash that I just forgot to hold off until the second boil to add the hops. Up front, Malcolm, do you think there's going to be an issue? The alpha acid may detract from the souring abilities of the lactic acid bacteria?
Only if you had a super, super non-tolerant yeast or lactose strain. So that amount is not a big deal. But I love the fact that you said, "Oh, you have to add hops; it's tradition," and you're using freaking oats and Berliner Weisse. So that to me is hilarious.
Yeah,
it's I'm just used to doing this, so I just add these hops here.
I'm telling you, man, my brain doesn't make sense to me most of the time. Trust me. So following this, I did this 15-minute boil. Following the 15-minute boil, rather than chilling the wort back down to that, that souring temperature between 95 and 100 degrees Fahrenheit with my immersion chiller, it was time for my friends to pack up and go. So they did. And then I just left the wort covered in my garage, ate dinner with my family. And I came back 2-3 hours later to see if it was down at that temperature yet. And it was. And I took a refractometer then, and it showed that the wort was at a 1031 OG, which to me is pretty perfect for this style. That's going to keep you in that really low ABV, nice crushable Berliner Weisse. Where do you like to have your Berliner Weisse OG when you're making one, Malcolm?
I like them to be probably like 3.5% ish, 3 to 4.5, somewhere on there. I want to be able to. I'm kind of a traditionalist, so I just want to make it how it would be, close to it, anyways. Yeah. But I don't mind there being a little bit of alcohol, because you will see traditionally they were as low as 2%, and that's a bit too. That's a kvass at that point.
It's like water, basically. Yeah. So while not totally finished, again, we'd only been brewing for an hour at the point where I chilled that wort down. And then again, I let it sit for a couple hours. So the weird brew day in terms of length of time, because it was longer than normal, but I wasn't doing much. So it didn't involve me actually working too hard to make it. Again, it took about 2 hours for the wort to drop to 111 Fahrenheit or 44 degrees Celsius, which is when I came back out and inoculated it with perhaps the simplest souring agent, in my opinion. I just took about a cup of uncrushed grain. I don't think it matters what grain you use. I'm pretty sure I went with the Mecca grade La Manta, but I took about a cup of that and I threw it into just a small hop bag that I'd had sitting in some Star San solution. So it was nice and sanitized. Not that matters at this point, I don't think, but I threw the grains in there, cinched up the top, tossed that into the wort, and then I put the lid of my kettle back on top, and I wrapped the edge of that with saran wrap. I've since learned that that's probably not necessary. The main reason I do it isn't to keep oxygen out. We've done an experiment on that. It doesn't seem to have a big impact. I do it to keep any small bugs out. Like I don't want fruit flies and stuff getting into the wort. So I wrap the edge of that, and since my kettle has a valve on the bottom, it's really easy for me to go and steal samples to test that, how far along it is. And that's exactly what I did. I set the controller to 95 degrees Fahrenheit or 35 C, and I left it alone for 36 hours before I came back. And so it's sitting at that temperature for that 36 hours, a day and a half. I came back and took a pH measurement and found that it had dropped to a 3.3 pH. Again, that's not titratable acidity. That's just your standard pH, which can vary in terms of how the perceived acidity of that. But I was pleased with the way the beer, or the wort at least, was tasting at this point. So I removed the saran wrap, took the grains out, the souring grains out, and then I heated the wort back up to boil for 10 minutes to kill off any of those microbes. Again, because I want my fermentation now with clean yeast to start kind of with this blank sour slate, if you will. That's the process that I prefer. I know, Malcolm, you mentioned earlier that you sometimes you do this quote no boil where you don't worry about that part of it.
Yeah. So two things. One, the grain inoculation has made some of my best and worst Berliners.
You hear that often, actually.
Yeah. When it's great, it's magical. I've gotten these lemony, bright, almost juice, lemon juice like sour batches.
Yeah.
And I've also gotten some stinkers. More success than stinker, but another technique too is you can pre-acidify. So some people say it's not necessary, especially with commercial pitches, but you can bring your pH down to like 4.6, and that'll preclude some of the nasty microbes that can give some off flavors. I've had a lot of success using commercial pitches now, but also for years I used Ultimate Flora, which is probiotic. Now, the no boil thing I've done a few times, and again, I've made my best and worst batches this way. The best ones because they come off that raw, doughy, rising, starter, and I've had ones that kind of went funky on me.
Yeah.
So, and in fact, historically, there's been notes from a few breweries that say, hey, pitch your yeast 3 or 4 or 5 times and then refresh, go back to the well. But also they say, do no boil. And then they say, but once you start having troubles, you may want to boil. So that's kind of neat, because these are directions from the author. I mentioned him earlier, Grinnell. So Grinnell was basically chronicling various techniques from various places, and he mentioned this, like, oh yeah, do this, but once it starts going funky, you may want to consider a boil. But yeah, I think you can do either, and I like the idea of the consistency and the repeatability of boiling, because you kind of set the stage. You lock everything in. Yep.
Yeah. And that's why I do it. I want to know I'm locking in that acid character that I just spent 36 hours creating. Now I'm going to go back and ferment it. And for me, that's, now I'll be honest. I've had beers. A lot of people locally here, a lot of my local brewing friends use Good Belly, which is basically a liquid probiotic, if you will. I mean, it's a yogurt drink, I believe. And I've had people ask, if you're buying Good Belly, do you buy the peach one? Do you buy the blueberry one or whatever? The flavor, you're using so little that in my experience, at least drinking these beers that have been soured with Good Belly, you don't taste the flavor of the Good Belly. The lactic acid, you don't at all. I don't think
4 ounces in 5 gallons.
Yeah.
You're just not going to taste it.
Yeah. And so Good Belly is a good option. It's cheap. That Pro Flora stuff you're talking about is remarkably spendy. I've looked into it before. I mean, you to get a box of it, it's like $35, right?
It's been a while. Ultimate Flora. Yeah. But you get like, a year's worth of tablets.
And you just use one tablet? I've never used a probiotic like that.
I forget. I did the math and got close to the pitch rates recommended on Milk the Funk, So it was a couple tablets. And I think one batch, one bottle of Ultimate Flora was, like you said, $30-something.
Yeah.
And I probably got 10, 15 batches out of it. I forget.
So not too bad in the long run then. Yeah. And again, I used grain in this one, and I've done that a few times. Now, I want to give a little plug here to our friend Derek Springer. He has a great write-up on his blog, 5bladesbrewing.com, about making starters with uncrushed grain, and his whole idea with doing that is you're reducing your risk. There's so many things when you experiment, you are assuming an element of risk that you might ruin something. Like you said, Malcolm, using grain has been some of your best and it's been some of your worst because it makes it very unpredictable. If you take a starter and you take a flask and you put some grain in there, put some wort in there, and then you let that kind of do its thing for a while, now you have a basis for what you can expect expect when you use that grain. And then you can just pitch that whole starter with the grain, or you could filter it out because now all that lactic acid bacteria is in the wort, and then you can throw that into your souring, the wort that you want to sour as well. Now,
what I like about that is that you can do the grain starter in the flask and go, oh, that's not it. That's yucky.
Right. So
you throw it away. And then if you have these Ultimate Flora tabs or a yogurt cup or a Good Belly in your fridge, that's plan B.
There you go. Yeah. And I love that too. I remember when I was making my first Berliner Weisse using this method, and I told Derek that I just tossed grains in a hot bag and put them in the wort, and he's, shaking his head. You have no idea how bad this could be. I got lucky.
You're reckless.
Yeah,
you are reckless.
I'm so reckless. That's what it is. So anyways, that's what I did. Once it was sour enough to where I wanted it after that 36 hours, I did bring it up to a boil for 10 minutes. We didn't add hops at this point because I already added them. Well, Tim added them on the day of brewing. But then I chilled that wort down to 65 degrees Fahrenheit or 18 degrees Celsius. It was wintertime, so I just left it out in my garage, and that's about what my garage maintains in the winter here. I'm not complaining. I was running low on yeast options, as I was with grain options as well, apparently. At the time, I had some L17 Harvest, and that was the cleanest yeast in my fridge. So I just took out that traditional lager strain, Harvest, one of my favorites, ripped it open, sanitized the pack, ripped it open, and I tossed it into that sour wort and held it there. My garage actually wavered between about 60 degrees Fahrenheit or 16C and 65 or 66 degrees Fahrenheit, which is around 19C. And so I just left it out on the shelf in my garage, pitched that L17 Harvest and let it go. Fermentation activity was noticed the following day, and it only took about 2 or 3 days for that activity to completely die down. I mean, it was 1031 OG, so you don't expect it to take very long anyways. After 3 days, I took a hydrometer measurement, and it showed that the beer finished at 1010 FG, which means that it was a whopping 2.7% ABV.
Wow, nice.
Yeah, perfect for me. Yeah, refreshing, low. I'm glad it finished at 1010 and not much lower than that. To me, that's kind of a nice, given the low OG, still allows you to keep some of that, ostensibly some of that, those longer chain dextrins in solution there, so that it doesn't super thin out the beer. Seeing as it had only been 3 days, I was a little bit lazy. I left the beer in my garage for a few more days before returning to keg it up. I didn't cold crash or anything like that. So I racked I racked the beer to I'm sure it was a purged keg. I placed that filled keg in my keezer, and then I burst carbonated it by putting it at 45 PSI of CO2 onto the keg for 20 hours. So pretty long time. And then I reduced the gas to a serving pressure of 14 PSI, which is about 2 PSI higher than I serve most of my other beers. My goal here again was I really wanted it to have that nice sparkle, and it only took about 2 days for it to balance out, and it certainly achieved it. It was nice and sparkling, very fizzy, and after 3 days in my keezer, the beer was perfectly carbonated and ready to serve. So as complicated as this process may sound, it's actually quite easy. There's just a couple extra steps that make it take a little bit longer, but I effectively turned this beer around in a week. And that's a sour beer that you can turn around in a week. I think that's pretty impressive and exciting for people who enjoy this, this style of beer.
Yeah, I've done them in maybe not quite a week, but 9 days, and commercial too. There's a lot less going on. The super low ABV. There is a split mash and second boil day often involved, and it can occupy a kettle. I've seen some people that will, on the pro side, have more than one kettle to do this. But for the home brewers, you just kind of set it aside and forget it. You can do other stuff the next day.
Exactly.
So even though it takes, quote, 2 days to make the beer, it's like 2 hours, 1 hour one day, and then an hour or two. And I actually found it very convenient for my life. It lends itself perfectly to short and shoddy because of the short boils and everything. And you could get up in the morning, do an hour or two while breakfast is being eaten by your family. So awesome for that reason all by itself.
And there's this thing when brewers are just starting out, you make that first batch and the science, you understand the chemistry and the microbiology that's going on. But still, when you see that wort fermenting, that beer fermenting, you toss this yeast in, there's something, it just feels exciting. It almost feels magical that you've created this thing. Once that fades away, Get into souring because it brings that all back up again. Plus, you're sampling it to taste it. Oh my God, there's that nice tart character that I'm looking for. I love it. I think it's just super exciting, and the fact that it's so easy and quick just adds to my enjoyment of this style and of the process of making it. Now, unlike other examples of Berliner Weisse I've had over the years, the acidity on this one was less sharp in my own samples of it, and more rounded, which I tend to think may have had to do with the flaked oats being there as opposed to the wheat malt or any form of wheat. It was really, really nice. You hear people describe New England IPA as being kind of cloudy and kind of having this softer overall characteristic to it. That's how I perceived this Berliner Weisse, and it was quite a bit different than what I've had in the past, but it was good. It still had that nice lactic tartness, just softer, if that makes sense.
No, absolutely. So when I first started making them, my first introduction to a Berliner and a Goza was at a competition, and I hadn't had it yet. It was entered in like a historic experimental category. This is like 2004 or 5 or 6, whatever. And I had to go over to a experienced judge and be like, "What the hell is this?" And I was a beer person. I hadn't heard of Goza, and so I was like, "What is this?" And she was like, "Oh, I've only had a little bit of experience with that. Go ask this guy." And that guy happened to be Gordon Strong, and he had a PDF from the upcoming update, and he let me read it, and I was like, "This sounds wild," And then I started drinking it, and I was just like, "Whoa, this is amazing!" It's like so light and refreshing. It's one of those beers I set aside, and it was like, I'm gonna drink more of that later, bready, light, soft tartness. It was not enamel. Enamel stripping, which some of them are now because people try to do everything to extremes. It was a eye-opening, and as soon as I tasted that beer, what I knew is I wanted to make it. And it's one of those beers that people come over and they're not beer drinkers. You just say, "Just try this," and they're like, "This is like a spritzy lemonade," So it's kind of a neat beer for that. And we didn't talk about it much, only in the first part, but traditionally they were served with these syrups.
Yeah.
They were served with these syrups, and so they were acidic and light, but these bars would serve it mit Schuss, and it would be Himbeer, which is raspberry, Woodruff, which is like this herbal woody plant, and then various other, versions, elderberry, I forget what the word for that, Hundel, something like that, elderberry syrup, and just... that was the way to balance the acidity. And you could look around at these places, these Berliner pubs, whatever, and they have these little short bowls with these different color liquids. And how is that much different than today with all these 16-ounce cans of quick sour Berliner with insert puree?
Yeah. Well, I did not fruit this Berliner Weisse. It was, I liked it straight, and it did have there was this lemony thing that I picked up on it. I don't like to say that though, because I know that it's my brain associating tartness with lemons. I do feel like there is an element of citrusy type of flavor that I got from this beer. It also had, and I love this very subtle but pleasant funkiness. I don't know how else to describe it, that I only get when I do quick sours with grain. I'm sure it's because of some contribution of maybe wild yeast that's on the grain that's doing something like that, but it is really, really nice, and it adds to the complexity of the beer. I love that. It's one of the reasons that I really enjoy souring with unmalt or uncrushed grain. The higher carbonation combined with the lower OG also contributed to this perception of dryness that made me want to keep coming back for more and for more and for more. This was one of the easiest drinking beers I've made in a long time.
Absolutely, and that's why I like it, because it's so light, and it lends itself to. I know you were drinking it straight, unadulterated, but it lends itself to the things that people do, such as add purees.
Yeah,
but you can also, it's a great combination. Is take your favorite trash lager, like Hams, which I love, Miller Lite, whatever, and splash a little bit of Berliner on top of it. It is wonderful.
Really?
Instead of adding a lemon, that is your quote lemon. That is your flavorant. And you just do like a spritzer topper.
That does sound
nice,
interesting. I'll have to try that out sometime. Next time I have a Berliner Weisse on.
Yeah, by the pool or playing yard games, that's a great way to try it.
Hell yeah. Well, now this beer was brewed before we started collecting actual data on Short and Shoddy the way we do pre-COVID. But I did share it with a couple of friends of mine. First and foremost, beer reviewer extraordinaire Timmy Tim Meisch, who loves sour beers. He has become, as all of you I'm sure you know, has become an absolute fan of pretty much anything that's tart and beer like. So when I served it to him, I took note of exactly what he said. He said, that's a sour, but it's not as sour as other sours I've had. It's like, yeah, it's nice, just a little sour, like sour water or something. I could drink a lot of this. Sour water. Hey,
sour water. It's probably not inaccurate because it's probably less than, one Play-Doh, so that's pretty darn watery, thin,
Yeah. Honestly, it is such a simple base that it, there's not much else getting in the way, and unless you're really looking for malt characteristics or you want to use those descriptors, it really is just kind of this thin, fizzy, sour deliciousness. So I don't think he's way off. Now, I also served this beer to another friend of Tim's and mine. He was hanging out in the garage with us, named Derek Florin, who usually only drinks when the mountains are blue. He's one of those types. And I word for word, here's what he said. What the hell is this shit? Oh my God, who would put that in their mouth? There's a reason they stopped making this in the 16th century, except they didn't stop making it. I think you misinterpreted me on that one, but I'd say that it was a success. I mean, if you've got a guy who doesn't like beer saying that he doesn't like it, I mean, that doesn't hurt my feelings, but in my opinion, overall, it was an absolutely delicious version of the example of the style. The thing is, it wasn't because of that, the use of flaked oats, I have to imagine, it did make it different than other Berliner Weisses I've made and that I've had, but I liked it. I didn't know what to expect. I wasn't expecting it to be anywhere near as good as it was, and I was very pleased with it.
Yeah, I think I would miss the wheat component, but I'll try anything twice. So I like the ingenuity of just saying, what do we have?
Yeah.
And you know what you were going for. You wanted some complexity and you wanted some, like an oaty character versus the wheat character. So,
yeah.
Why not? That's the beauty of home brewing. So that's a perfect example of home brewing. Next time you should probably text me. I'll tell you how to enjoy your hobby.
There we go. Yeah. Well,
you're enjoying your hobby the wrong way.
Oh yeah. Well, I can't say that I preferred this Short and Shoddy version that I made, the Mithofer, if you will, over a standard one, but I liked it enough to where I would brew it again. Now, as far as souring with grains go, I've spent a lot of time talking about it. This was the third or fourth batch that I'd done this with, and I love it. There is this complexity that I get from using that approach. At the same time, it is you are taking a risk when you do that, and so if you are less or if you're more risk averse, and you still want to try it, I'd recommend checking out fivebladesbrewing.com. Look at Derek's write up on how to make these grain starters, basically, because that is a little bit safer. Or you can just go to the lab and get some commercial or whatever, nicely packaged and clean lactic acid bacteria. You could also try Good Belly, something like that. But I love the fact that this came out as good as it did using such simple approach as tossing in some uncrushed grain. So I was pleased with it. I wish we had the survey built by then, but we don't. But it came out well, and everybody I served it to really enjoyed it. I think a lot of my friends who are professional brewers in town actually had the opportunity to try this one as well, and were impressed that the flaked oats could produce such a tasty Berliner Weisse. So there you have it. We do have some reader comments. The first one comes from Aaron. He says, how many batches have you soured with uncrushed malt? None taste like rot. Why uncrushed? It looks very tasty. Okay, I think the reason you do uncrushed is because you just don't need to crush it. The endosperm, you're not using that, so it's easier just to toss in uncrushed grain. Now, this was, like I said, this was my third or fourth batch doing that. The very first time I messed around with uncrushed grain, it was a complete and utter mess. I didn't know what I was doing. I was just having some fun with it, and it did come out bad. But I didn't do a whole batch. I just did this small amount of leftover wort to see what would happen, and I left it out in the sun for 2 days. I mean, it was disgusting. But ever since then, the ones that I've done intentionally, where I've been thoughtful about it, have come out really well. I think, you just got to be careful not to introduce anything else and not to let it sit in the wort for too long. And then again, this is another reason that I like to bring the soured wort up to a boil to knock all that stuff out before fermenting it with a clean strain.
Yeah, I remember 2 or 3 that I did way back, and what I did is I used a little miniature beverage cooler, not like the big ones people use for mash tuns, but it was like one of those little small ones you'd use for like a soccer game or a football game. And I put the grain and some wort in there, and I covered it with saran wrap and closed the lid. And when I came back the next day and I smelt that lemony, yogurty, clean, non-funky batch of soured, grain inoculated sour wort, I was just like, I couldn't wait to use it. I was like, I hope the next thing, the bigger 10-gallon version, tastes anything close to this.
Yeah.
And I've done that method multiple times. The ones that come out bad, I assume it's because of a dirty container. I don't know if it's oxygen ingress because, like you said, there seems to be some myth busting there. But because of we don't know what's on the outside of that grain, so like you said, we don't need to crush it because you don't need what's inside. The lactobacillus, because it's ubiquitous in the air, it's on the outside of the grain.
Yeah.
So
it's just not necessary to crush it. It's a waste of time to do that. You're not trying to get those starches out of the kernel. So, next comment comes from Adam Joyce. He says, "I've been thinking of a kettle sour like this for a bit. Very simple idea. I may boost up the gravity a hair, then age it on peaches for a month before kegging." Ooh, that sounds good.
Yeah. Awesome.
Yeah. I've had a thought that, the way that I make hard cider is very complicated. I basically just ferment the cheapest store-bought apple juice I can find. And then once it's done fermenting, before I do any treatment to it, I add fruit to it, usually frozen fruit, allow those fruit sugars to ferment out. And then I'll add my sorbate and metabisulfite and all that stuff. I've had a similar idea for Berliner Weisse, get it soured, boil it, ferment it out, do all that stuff. And then when it's done fermenting, add some frozen peaches or frozen berries or something like that. Let that re-ferment out and then package it. I have a feeling that'd be really good.
Yeah, I don't see why. I don't see why it wouldn't be. I mean, it sounds good to me.
Yeah. So there's something I'm going to try in the future. All right. Final comment comes from Chad. He says, I was having trouble finding a commercial Berliner Weisse, so I made one on a smaller scale with the yogurt function on my wife's Instant Pot. I made a 1-gallon extract batch with about 60% wheat, 40% Pilsner malt, soured with Lacto del Bruckii to pH of 3.0 in just 20 hours, and then fermented it with USO5. It turned out great, but I'm not sure how well it represents the style.
I've had mixed luck with the Bruckii. Now, funny enough, some of the old cultures of bottles and stuff like that seem to indicate that was the prevalent lactobacillus strain. But when the one I've used from a popular yeast lab did not give me great results. And early on, like 2012 or 13, I took a bunch of the lacto strains that were available, including some Ultimate Flora and grain inoculation, and I made a bunch of little miniature sour batches, starters similar to what Derek mentioned. And my least favorite was the major yeast lab with the Bruckii. It had this earthy funkiness. It had the least aggressive pH drop, and the titratable acid was only in the 3 to 4 grams per liter range, compared to 9-10 for the other versions. So who knows? I mean, I've heard people having great luck with the Bruckii, so maybe it was me, maybe it was that batch. I don't know.
Yeah. Well, and he says he's not sure how well it represents the style. Based on the discussion that we had earlier about how broad this style really was, if it's somewhat tart, lower ABV, pale, slightly hazy, and relatively clean, I would say that you probably nailed the style. I mean, unless it got super funky or something, but the process that he outlines here, that Chad outlines here, sounds like he nailed it. I mean, I've never used Del Bruckii on its own, but yeah, sounds like he probably did a pretty good job.
And if you like it, who cares?
Yeah, exactly. So, if it's good to you, who cares about styles, right? All right, Malcolm, I think that about covers Berliner Weisse. Anything else before we finish up?
Experiment. Great style to add another ingredient in or sub one out, or to mix later, because that was traditional, to add a shot of flavoring. You can make your own syrups, or you can add it in the keg. And then, it's a great way for if you have people over for a party or a barbecue or playing yard games, make some syrups, make some additives, bring some purees, make a Berliner, and then you can dose them. It's a lot of fun.
Yeah, it really is. We had when I had this on, I had the Amaretti blood orange squirt bottle next to my Keyser, and people were blending it with that. It's really nice. It's a great style to experiment with. I couldn't agree more. Well, don't forget, you can click the link in the description of this episode to read all about this short and shoddy Berliner Weisse. The Brulosophy podcast is made possible by the generous support of our sponsors as well as all of our rad listeners. We seriously could not do this without you. Cheers to everyone who has subscribed and left a review of our show. It makes a huge difference. If you haven't yet, please consider doing so. Head over to brulosophy.com/support to view a list of ways you can easily help us to continue producing this podcast. If you want a reward for your support, visit patreon.com/brulosophy. Thanks again for listening. We'll be back next week with another episode of the Brulosophy podcast. Until then, think beer.
Start off the morning with some hot tea, lemon and honey cause it suits my bro. Put some herb in the bowl, yeah, it's homegrown. Ain't gotta go through the middleman no more.